August 5, 1962. The California sun hangs heavy over Brentwood, casting long shadows across the Spanish-style home at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive. Inside, silence fills the rooms where laughter once echoed. The pills scattered across the nightstand tell a story that the world will debate for decades to come. 15 empty bottles of Nembutal and chloral hydrate, a telephone receiver dangling from her lifeless hand, and a woman who had become the most desired figure on earth lying motionless in her bed. Marilyn Monroe was dead at 36. The housekeeper's scream pierces the evening air at 3 a.m., though she claims she discovered the body much earlier. Dr. Hyman Engelberg arrives, followed by psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson, both men whose presence that night would later fuel endless speculation. The official cause: probable suicide by barbiturate overdose. But in a city where truth often wore makeup and lies came dressed as headlines, nothing was ever quite what it seemed. The phone calls made and received that final evening remain mysterious. Robert Kennedy's name whispered in hushed corridors. The missing diary that allegedly contained secrets powerful enough to topple governments. The suspicious delay in calling authorities. Was this really the desperate final act of a troubled starlet, or had Marilyn Monroe known too much about the wrong people? As news of her death spread across the globe, the world mourned not just an actress, but a symbol they had created and ultimately destroyed. From Times Square to Tokyo, her image flickered on screens and blazed from newspaper headlines. But perhaps the most haunting question wasn't how she died, but how the innocent girl named Norma Jeane Mortensen had transformed into an icon whose very existence became unbearable. To understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. In a world where dreams and nightmares often wore the same face, and where the price of perfection was always higher than anyone imagined. The year was 1926, and America was dancing on the edge of the Great Depression. In Los Angeles General Hospital, a baby girl entered a world that would both worship and destroy her. Born Norma Jeane Mortensen to Gladys Pearl Baker, she arrived into chaos masquerading as normalcy. Her mother, a film cutter at Consolidated Film Industries, lived in a reality that shifted like California sand, her grip on sanity as fragile as the celluloid she spliced together each day. Gladys had already surrendered 2 children to her ex-husband, and now, faced with this blonde, blue-eyed baby, she made a decision that would echo through decades. Unable to care for her daughter, she placed Norma Jeane with foster families, beginning a childhood odyssey of temporary homes and broken promises. The baby who would become the world's most photographed woman grew up believing that love was something you earned, not something freely given. In the modest home of Albert and Ida Bolander, strict Christian fundamentalists, young Norma Jeane learned her first lessons about performance and survival. She discovered that being good, being quiet, being perfect might earn her a moment's affection. But even in this religious household, darkness crept in. When a boarder attempted to assault her at age 8, she told Ida, only to be dismissed and blamed. The pattern was set. Norma Jeane's truth would always be questioned, her pain minimized, her voice silenced by those who claimed to protect her. Could these early experiences of betrayal and abandonment have planted the seeds for her later desperate need for validation? Was the child who learned to smile through tears already becoming the woman who would perfect the art of hiding anguish behind beauty? The revolving door of foster homes continued, each placement promising stability that never came. In one home, she was sexually abused by a foster father. In another, she was treated as an unwelcome burden. Through it all, Norma Jeane developed what would become her greatest survival mechanism: the ability to become whatever others needed her to be. She watched movies obsessively, studying the faces of Jean Harlow and Greta Garbo, unconsciously learning the grammar of glamour that would later define her existence. At age 16, faced with the prospect of returning to an orphanage, Norma Jeane made a choice that seemed to offer escape. Marriage to James Doherty, a neighbor 21 years old. But marriage to a man who saw her as a pretty doll to display was simply another form of captivity. When he left for military service in 1944, she found work at the Radio Plane Munitions Factory, assembling parachutes and spray-painting airplane parts. It was there, among the noise and chemical fumes of wartime production, that destiny finally found her. David Conover, a photographer documenting women's contributions to the war effort, spotted her instantly. Her natural luminosity seemed to gather light like a magnet, and when his camera captured her face, something magical happened. The factory girl disappeared, and in her place stood a woman who seemed to embody every man's fantasy and every woman's dream of transformation. But was this discovery truly fortune? Or was it the moment when Norma Jeane began to disappear forever, replaced by an image that would eventually consume the woman who created it? The camera loved her with an intensity that bordered on possession. Within months of that first photo shoot, she had shed her brown hair for platinum blonde, transformed her body through diet and exercise, and divorced the husband who represented her past. By 1946, she had signed with Blue Book Modeling Agency and chosen a new name that would become legendary. Marilyn Monroe, combining the allure of Broadway star Marilyn Miller with her mother's maiden name. But success in modeling was just the beginning of a journey that would demand everything she had, to give and more. The Hollywood of the late 1940s was a machine designed to manufacture dreams and devour dreamers. For every star who blazed across screens, dozens of hopefuls burned out in cheap apartments and casting offices, their aspirations becoming cautionary tales whispered in studio commissaries. Marilyn's early film contracts with 20th Century Fox were exercises in humiliation disguised as opportunity. She was dismissed as just another pretty face, given bit parts that required little more than looking beautiful and saying few lines. Her first significant role in The Asphalt Jungle lasted barely 10 minutes, but her magnetic presence on screen was undeniable. Studio executives began to notice the blonde who could make even the smallest role memorable. The path to stardom was paved with compromises that chipped away at her soul. The studio system of the era treated actors like property, controlling every aspect of their lives from their appearance to their relationships. Marilyn endured this with a smile that became her trademark. But behind closed doors, she was already developing the insomnia and anxiety that would plague her entire career. She began studying acting seriously, desperate to be taken seriously as more than just a pretty face. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? Each small victory came at the cost of another piece of her authentic self, as Norma Jeane retreated further into the shadows while Marilyn Monroe blazed brighter. The breakthrough came with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953, where her performance of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend became an instant cultural phenomenon. The image of Marilyn in that pink dress surrounded by tuxedoed men crystallized her position as the ultimate symbol of post-war American sexuality. But with fame came a new kind of imprisonment. She was typecast as the dumb blonde, a role that bore no resemblance to the intelligent, sensitive woman she actually was. Her personal relationships during this period revealed the growing chasm between her public and private selves. Her affair with baseball legend Joe DiMaggio brought her into contact with American royalty, but their marriage in 1954 lasted only 9 months. DiMaggio wanted a traditional wife. The world wanted Marilyn Monroe. The famous subway great scene from The 7-Year Itch, where her white dress billowed up around her legs, delighted audiences but infuriated her husband, who saw his wife being objectified for the world's entertainment. The divorce from DiMaggio marked a turning point. Determined to be taken seriously as an actress, Marilyn shocked Hollywood by moving to New York to study at the prestigious Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg. This decision was seen as career suicide by many, but it revealed her desperate desire to be more than just a beautiful object. She immersed herself in the method acting technique, reading Dostoevsky and Chekhov, writing poetry in her diary, and struggling to bridge the gap between Marilyn Monroe the icon and Norma Jeane the woman. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn Monroe had achieved everything she had dreamed of as a foster child: fame, wealth, and worldwide adoration. Magazine covers, Hollywood premieres, and crowds that screamed her name wherever she appeared. She commanded enormous salaries and had the power to greenlight projects. From the outside, her life appeared to be a fairy tale made real. The mansion in Brentwood, the designer gowns, the private jets, and the constant attention of the world's media painted a picture of a woman who had everything. Her films grossed millions, her image sold countless products, and her very presence could stop traffic in any major city. She had transcended mere celebrity to become a cultural force, inspiring artists, musicians, and writers around the globe. But behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The reality of Marilyn's daily existence was far removed from the public fantasy. Chronic insomnia plagued her nights, requiring increasingly powerful medications just to achieve a few hours of sleep. Her dependency on pills, uppers to function during the day, downers to sleep at night, created a chemical roller coaster that her body struggled to endure. The pressure to maintain her image was relentless. Every public appearance required perfection: the perfect dress, the perfect smile, the perfect pose. A single unflattering photograph could dominate headlines for weeks. The woman who had sought love and acceptance had instead found herself trapped inside an image that felt increasingly foreign to who she really was. Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller in 1956 represented her attempt to find intellectual companionship and stability. Miller, a Pulitzer Prize winner known for Death of a Salesman, seemed to offer the gravitas and respectability she craved. But even this relationship became complicated by her celebrity. Miller found himself constantly defending his wife against critics who dismissed her as merely a Hollywood bimbo, while she struggled with his intellectual friends who treated her as an amusing curiosity rather than an equal. The pregnancy she lost in 1957 devastated her. Multiple miscarriages followed, each loss deepening her sense that happiness was something that happened to other people. The woman who had become the world's symbol of fertility and sexuality could not carry a child to term, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on her. She poured her maternal instincts into her pets and into caring for others, but the absence of children remained a wound that never healed. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the weight of being Marilyn Monroe had become almost unbearable. She was no longer just a person. She was a brand, a fantasy, a product to be sold and consumed. The spontaneous joy that had once lit up her performances was increasingly replaced by professional competence maintained through sheer will and chemical assistance. The year 1961 brought a scandal that would forever alter the trajectory of her life and ultimately contribute to her tragic end. During the filming of The Misfits, written by her husband Arthur Miller, Marilyn's behavior became increasingly erratic. Her chronic lateness, memory problems, and emotional outbursts frustrated cast and crew. The film, which would become her last completed work, was an expensive disaster that damaged her reputation in Hollywood. But it was what happened away from the cameras that would prove most dangerous. Through her connection to actor Peter Lawford, Marilyn was introduced into the inner circle of the Kennedy family. President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, the Attorney General, were regular visitors to parties where Marilyn was present. What began as casual encounters at political gatherings soon developed into something far more complicated and potentially explosive. The affair with John F. Kennedy, while brief, was conducted with a recklessness that seems almost incomprehensible in hindsight. Secret Service agents later testified to her visits to the White House. Phone records showed frequent calls between them. She even had a private telephone number that allegedly connected directly to the president. For a woman who had spent her life seeking validation from powerful men, the attention of the most powerful man in the world must have felt like the ultimate confirmation of her worth. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The relationship with Robert Kennedy was even more dangerous. Bobby, as he was known, was not just the president's brother but also the nation's chief law enforcement officer, leading investigations into organized crime figures who had their own complex relationships with both Hollywood and politics. When Marilyn began calling his office frequently, threatening to reveal their relationship, she crossed a line that placed her in genuine danger. The famous performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962, was Marilyn's most public display of her connection to the Kennedy family. Sewn into a dress so tight she had to be stitched into it, she breathed sensuality into the simple birthday song in a way that scandalized and mesmerized the nation. But what seemed like a triumph was actually a warning. The performance was so overtly sexual, so publicly intimate, that it forced the Kennedy administration to completely sever ties with her. The rejection by the Kennedy brothers sent Marilyn into a spiral of desperation that her friends found frightening. She had invested so much hope in these relationships, seeing them as validation of her intelligence and worth beyond her sexuality. When she was cut off, the abandonment triggered all the childhood trauma she had never fully processed. She began making phone calls that were increasingly incoherent, talking about exposing secrets and revealing truths that could destroy careers and governments. Her diary from this period, which mysteriously disappeared after her death, allegedly contained details about conversations with both Kennedy brothers regarding everything from Cuba to the fight against organized crime. If even half the rumors were true, Marilyn Monroe had become one of the most dangerous women in America simply by being present when powerful men forgot to guard their words. The woman who had spent her life being underestimated by men was now feared by some of the most powerful men in the world. The transformation was complete. The victim had become a threat, and in the brutal calculus of politics and power, threats had to be eliminated. The months following her banishment from the Kennedy circle were a study in disintegration. Marilyn's mental health, always fragile, began to crumble under the weight of rejection, professional disappointment, and her increasing isolation from the very world that had created her. The pills that had once been occasional aids for sleep and anxiety became a daily necessity for basic functioning. Her firing from Something's Got to Give in June 1962 was the professional humiliation that broke something essential inside her. 20th Century Fox, the studio that had made her a star, publicly blamed her for the film's delays and cost overruns. The official reason was her chronic lateness and inability to remember lines, but industry insiders knew the real issue was her deteriorating mental state. The woman who had once been the studio's most bankable star was now seen as unreliable and unemployable. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Marilyn, the answer seemed increasingly clear. She attempted suicide on August 5, 1962, just 2 months after being fired. The attempt, initially hushed up by her psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson, was a cry for help that went largely unheard. Instead of receiving the intensive treatment she desperately needed, she was encouraged to increase her therapy sessions and continue taking the medications that were slowly killing her. The transformation in her personality during these final months was heartbreaking to witness. Friends reported that the vivacious, if troubled woman they had known was disappearing, replaced by someone who seemed to be slowly fading away. She spoke frequently of death, not with the dramatic flair of someone seeking attention, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had given up hope. Her last photo shoot with George Barris in July 1962 captured this change perfectly. While the photographs showed her legendary beauty intact, Those who were present reported that she seemed to be looking beyond the camera, beyond the moment, towards something only she could see. She spoke to Barris about her loneliness, her fear of growing old in Hollywood, and her regret about the children she would never have. The notebook she kept during these final weeks, filled with fragments of poetry and philosophical observations, revealed a woman grappling with profound questions about identity, authenticity, and the price of fame. One entry read, "Please don't make me a joke. End the joke now." It was a plea that would only be understood after it was too late to answer. Her increasing paranoia, whether justified or not, painted a picture of someone who felt hunted. She spoke of phones being tapped, of being followed, of powerful forces working against her. Her friends initially dismissed these concerns as symptoms of her deteriorating mental health, but the events of August 5th would give them reason to reconsider everything they thought they knew about her final days. August 4th, 1962. The day began like so many others in the final chapter of Marilyn Monroe's life, with phone calls to friends expressing loneliness and desperation, with pills to manage anxiety, with the pretense of normalcy overlaying a reality that had become unbearable. But this day would be different. This day would be her last. The timeline of her final hours remains one of the most disputed sequences of events in Hollywood history. She spent the afternoon with her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who later claimed she seemed in better spirits than she had in weeks. She made several phone calls, including one to her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, with whom she had recently reconnected. The conversation, according to DiMaggio, was optimistic. She spoke of wanting to rebuild their relationship and perhaps remarry, but other accounts paint a darker picture. Peter Lawford later claimed that Marilyn called him that evening, her voice slurred and barely coherent, saying something that sounded like, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy." The line then went dead. When he tried to call back, there was no answer. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question would haunt everyone who knew her, and everyone who claimed to have answers about her death. What happened between 8 p.m. when she was last seen alive by Dr. Greenson and 3 a.m. when her housekeeper Eunice Murray claimed to discover her body remains shrouded in mystery and contradiction. The scene that greeted investigators was carefully composed. Marilyn lying face down on her bed, telephone receiver in hand, empty pill bottles arranged on the nightstand. But details that should have been straightforward were confusing. The massive dose of Nembutal found in her blood showed no residue in her stomach, suggesting the drugs had been administered differently than by swallowing pills. The bedroom door was locked from the inside, but Murray claimed to have seen light under the door hours earlier, and only became concerned much later. The missing hours between her death and the reporting of it have fueled decades of speculation. Phone records from that night mysteriously disappeared. Robert Kennedy was in Los Angeles that day, though his presence was later denied by government officials. An ambulance was reportedly called and then mysteriously canceled before the police were finally notified. The red diary that allegedly contained her most sensitive secrets vanished and was never found. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the coroner who performed the autopsy, later expressed doubts about the suicide verdict. The lack of pills in her stomach, the strange pattern of lividity on her body, and the unusually high concentration of chloral hydrate all suggested possibilities other than the simple overdose initially reported. But in 1962, questioning the official story about America's most famous suicide was not encouraged. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The answer may lie in understanding who had the most to lose from Marilyn Monroe's continued existence. Her threats to hold a press conference and reveal everything she knew about her relationships with the Kennedy brothers had reached the wrong ears. In a world where image was everything and where political careers could be destroyed by scandal, Marilyn Monroe had become what intelligence agencies called a problem requiring a solution. The funeral 3 days later was orchestrated by Joe DiMaggio, who had loved her before she became Marilyn Monroe and who continued to love her after Hollywood was finished with her. He banned virtually everyone from the Hollywood community that had used and discarded her, limiting the service to 30 people who had genuinely cared about Norma Jeane, not just her famous persona. For 20 years afterward, DiMaggio had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week, a gesture of devotion that spoke to the love that Marilyn had spent her life seeking but rarely found. His loyalty to her memory was absolute. He never spoke publicly about their relationship or about his suspicions regarding her death. When he died in 1999, his final words were reportedly, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn again." The investigation into her death was closed within days, the verdict of probable suicide sealing the official narrative. But the unofficial story has never stopped evolving. Books, documentaries, and investigations have continued to chip away at the accepted version of events, revealing a web of connections between Hollywood, politics, and organized crime that was far more complex than anyone wanted to acknowledge in 1962. The FBI files on Marilyn Monroe, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed that she had indeed been under surveillance. The files document her association with individuals suspected of communist sympathies, her relationships with the Kennedy brothers, and concerns about her emotional stability. What they don't reveal is more telling than what they do. Entire sections are redacted, pages are missing, and key dates are unaccounted for. In the 6 decades since her death, Marilyn Monroe has become more than a person. She has become a symbol of how society creates and destroys its icons. Every generation has rediscovered her story and found new meaning in her tragedy. She has been seen as a victim of patriarchy, a casualty of the studio system, a collateral damage in political machinations, and a woman who simply could not survive the gap between who she was and who the world demanded her to be. The influence of her image extends far beyond entertainment. From Andy Warhol's silk screens that transformed her into art, to Madonna's conscious emulation of her style, to countless actresses who have tried to capture her unique combination of vulnerability and sexuality, Marilyn's presence continues to permeate popular culture. Even today, more than 60 years after her death, her estate earns millions annually from licensing deals, proving that her commercial value has outlasted many of the people who exploited her in life. But perhaps the most enduring mystery is not how she died, but how a woman of such evident intelligence and sensitivity became trapped in an image that ultimately destroyed her. The pills, the affairs, the mental health struggles were all symptoms of a deeper problem. The impossibility of being human while serving as a symbol for an entire culture's fantasies and fears about female sexuality. The diary entries that survived, the friends who truly knew her, and the rare unguarded moments captured on film all point to a woman who was far more complex and interesting than the persona that made her famous. She read voraciously, wrote poetry, studied photography, and dreamed of producing films that would tackle serious subjects. But these aspects of her personality were considered unmarketable by the industry that owned her image. The question that haunts anyone who studies her life is whether there was ever a path that could have led to a different ending. Could she have broken free from the expectations that imprisoned her? Could she have found a way to be both Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jeane? Or was the tragedy inevitable from the moment a lonely little girl learned that love was something you had to earn by becoming what others wanted you to be? Today, as we grapple with new understanding about mental health, addiction, and the pressures of fame, Marilyn's story reads less like a cautionary tale and more like a case study in how society fails its most vulnerable members. The little girl who was passed from home to home, who learned that her value lay in her appearance and her ability to please others, grew up to become the ultimate expression of these toxic lessons. The secret that Marilyn Monroe took to her grave was not about presidents or conspiracies or hidden affairs. The real secret was simpler and more heartbreaking. Behind the most desired woman in the world was a person who never learned to desire herself, who never found a way to exist outside the reflection she saw in other people's eyes. In death, she has found the love and acceptance that eluded her in life, but at a price that makes her adoration feel like another form of exploitation. We love her now safely, because she can no longer surprise us, disappoint us, or demand that we see her as anything other than what we need her to be. Was Marilyn Monroe murdered by the powerful men whose secrets she knew? Was she driven to suicide by the impossible pressures of fame? Or did she simply become another casualty in a war between authenticity and image that she was doomed to lose from the moment she chose to become someone other than herself? We made Marilyn Monroe a promise: be perfect, and we will love you forever. She kept her part. We didn't. The mystery of Marilyn Monroe is not hidden in classified files or covered-up evidence. It lives in the gap between who we wanted her to be and who she actually was, between the love we gave her image and the love we denied her humanity. In the end, Marilyn Monroe's greatest performance was not in any movie but in life itself, where she played the role of a woman who had everything while dying of loneliness. We loved Marilyn because she was perfect. We lost Norma because she wasn't allowed to be human. The standing ovation continues still, echoing through decades, beautiful and hollow as the applause that follows a ghost across an empty stage.